This video is for chapter 10, which is entitled Divorce, Remarriage, and Blended Families. Let's consider a quote from the opening section of the chapter. If the experience of divorce or the threat of divorce looms large in modern families, then we all live under a cloud of family uncertainty. And the opening section asks you to consider, what are the consequences of that? Traditionally, of course, one of the traits that we associate with family is stability and longevity. And we certainly know that family stability is particularly important, of course, for children. So if the threat of divorce or the possibility of divorce is looming over modern families and is contributing this instability. Certainly, sociologists are concerned about what type of impact that will have on the family. So let's consider what we know about divorce. It has become an increasingly normal part of the relationship process for many individuals. Your book talks about, how do we kind of reconcile, how do we balance, the desire for kind of personal freedom and individuality with the social constraints that are just inherent in the institution of marriage. As noted, a lot of the critics about divorce as a social institution are concerned about the instability that it creates in modern families. And they are especially concerned about the impact on children, which we will discuss further in the next section. The increase of divorce and remarriage in modern society is connected to the primary three themes of the textbook: family diversity, social class inequality, and social change. And Cohen does talk a little bit about how divorce and remarriage are connected to each of those. But certainly, an important takeaway is just that this increase in divorce and the increasing acceptance of divorce has changed the institution of marriage for everyone. And that's true whether or not they're personally involved in getting a divorce or not. So this first section does consider that impact on children, and is entitled For the Children's Sake. And it has that question: how is individual happiness to be balanced against family commitments? And oftentimes, that primary family commitment that is a concern, or is something that, people uh, are most aware of, or most concerned about, is the impact that divorce has on children. And so your book makes the point that some parents try to prevent or delay divorce for the children's sake, because they want to spare them the disruption, they want to spare the financial loss, they want to spare the shame, to the extent that shame still exists around getting a divorce. While other parents want a divorce for the children's sake, particularly if they see or feel that the divorce is going to eliminate constant bickering, and as well as potentially removing contact with a parent who is irresponsible or abusive. So the argument can just be made that there isn't a clear cut answer. Is it better for children or not for their parents to get a divorce? A lot of it, of course, has a lot to do with, the quality of the marriage, and whether or not ultimately it increases, or versus decreases stability for the child, for the parents to get a divorce as opposed to remaining married. We'll come back to the impact that divorce has on children later in this video. The second part of the chapter is entitled Church and State. In modern society, the state as an institutional arena has taken on more and more authority, and this has kind of shifted control away from the church. This is especially true when divorce is concerned. The church authority has become less powerful, and religion is now more of a personal choice and not a social requirement, which means that to the extent that the church still has power over people's decisions regarding marriage and family, decisions like getting a divorce, That power is going to vary by individuals, and it's going to vary by individual families, because the power of the church is just less socially pervasive as it once was. And so in a lot of ways, it is the government, it is the state authority, that is kind of setting policies and rules and requirements and requiring, certain processes and paperwork in regards to both marriage formation as well as marriage dissolution. Is no longer the church. And so, in order to kind of understand this shift in power, your textbook provides you several important terms, vocabulary terms that you need to know: marriage dissolution, separation, divorce, and annulment. Particularly if you're thinking about the balance of power between the church and the state, the concept of annulment is really important because it is an important distinction from the term divorce. And it has largely a religious background, because divorce is the legal dissolution of marriage according to the laws of the state. Um, it doesn't say that the marriage did not happen, it just says that the marriage has been dissolved. Annulment of marriage is a legal or religious determination that the marriage was never valid. And in many ways, this was seen as a way of accounting for, religious. Uh, Religious dictates that said, that a divorce was prohibited, right? Annulment was a way around that type of stance, because while a divorce was not going to be permitted, you could seek an annulment, which would basically say, it was like the marriage never happened. And so your book talks about this, especially by uh, highlighting the story of Henry VIII, and the Church of England. So for anyone that maybe has, watched the TV show, or maybe seen like one of the many movies kind of based on, Henry VIII, then you probably have heard the story about how he wanted to have his marriage annulled, from Catherine of Aragon, so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. And the church, the Catholic Church, refused. And so, to get around that, basically what he did was he formed his own church, the Church of England, which did grant him that annulment, which allowed him to marry Anne Boleyn. But normally, and your book makes this point, that ending a marriage has never been as controversial as remarrying afterwards and producing legitimate children. And so, that was the concern with the Catholic Church, at the time that they refused Henry VIII's request. It wasn't so much that he wanted his marriage with Catherine to be annulled, so much as he then wanted his children, by Anne, to be declared his rightful heirs, as opposed to his child, that he had had with Catherine. And so, despite the separation of church and state, that's enshrined in the US Constitution, there is still some conflict that persists between, religion and kind of the legal issues surrounding marriage. And at this point, in our society's history, of course, it has less to do with things like annulment and divorce, and it has more to do with things like same-sex marriages. But just know that this tension between church and state, has existed around previous, issues in the past. So this brings me to the third section of your chapter, which is divorce rates and trends. And so a lot of this section is about how do we address this question: what is the divorce rate? And Cohen notes that this is something that a lot of people want to know the answer to. but it's hard to answer. And he talks about why it's hard to answer. First of all, there is no systematic divorce tabulations, and many numbers are calculated by different groups, and they're just estimations. And so, because there is this no one single definition, and there's no systematic way of even getting that data, everything that we're working with is just kind of estimates. And so um he Cohen states that some of the best estimates are provided by the American Community Survey, and using that data, there are three different numbers that he discusses. There's the crude divorce rate, the refined divorce rate, and the divorce marriage rate. So the crude divorce rate is simply the number of divorces that have occurred in 1 year in the entire population. It's used to tell us how common divorce is in the entire country. And so currently, the crude divorce rate in the United States is 3.1 divorces for every 1,000 people. And so this is a chart that just kind of, is looking at the crude divorce rate between 1860 and 2011, pointing out, some kind of periods where we saw the crude divorce rate spike, after World War II, and then later, in the early 80s, as more and more states adopted no fault divorce laws, which I'll talk about more later in the presentation. The refined divorce rate tells us how many divorces there are for every 1,000 married couples in the country. So this rate tells us how common divorce is among married couples specifically, not just the entire population. Refined divorce rate also can be broken down by other characteristics like education or race and ethnicity. So if we're looking at the refined divorce rate, it's 15 divorces for every 1,000 married couples in the country. And then the final number is the divorce marriage ratio. And according to Cohen, this is actually the number that a lot of people are thinking of or referring to when they talk about the divorce rate. And maybe it's because we are just kind of socially conditioned to kind of discuss things, using the language of odds. What are the odds of my marriage ending? What's the likelihood of me getting a divorce? So this is the probability or odds of a married couple getting divorced in the future. And so currently the divorce marriage ratio is one divorce for every 2.1 marriages that year in the country. And so although it is, as the textbook notes, it is impossible to predict the future, there are some measures that we can kind of look to help provide a good generalization. And your book kind of discusses those patterns in a little bit more detail. And so if this is a question that is of interest or, of concern to you, I strongly encourage you to both, carefully read those pages in the textbook, as well as watch that animation, because that animation kind of talks about, it makes some educated guesses about how many people will get divorced in the future based on what we know about current day trends. So I mentioned this when I discussed the crude divorce rate, the number of divorces per 1,000 people in society. But let's now come back to this historical period we refer to as the divorce revolution, the period between 1960 and 1980, where there was a dramatic increase in divorce. And a lot of this was spurred on by divorce reform, reform in the policies, in the legal processes by which people could seek divorce. During this time period, marriage began to be just legally recognized as a voluntary contract between two individuals. And states, beginning with California, which passed the first no-fault divorce law in 1970, began to make it easier for people to get a divorce. If a marriage is just a voluntary contract between two people, then when one person wants to opt out of that voluntary contract, it should not necessarily be super difficult to do so. Before that, the only way to legally get a divorce was to make a accusation or charge against the other party. And there was also a very gendered aspect to this where, the charges and accusations that were deemed acceptable for women, as opposed to men, were much more limited in number. So, for instance, in early years, even abuse was not, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, even abuse was not seen as being a valid reason for granting a divorce. But now, with the kind of the construction of no fault divorce laws, which, by the time we reach the 80s, pretty much every state has them. It means that a couple could just say that they have irreconcilable differences, and they would not necessarily need a specific reason to request a divorce. And so, unsurprisingly, this does mean that the number of people who requested a divorce after the passage of such policies did increase. And so during this time period, with divorce becoming more common, it hasn't just impacted, the individuals getting a divorce, but it's had larger societal impacts, because it affects decision making about, like, whether or not people even consider marriage at all, and it impacts whom they marry, as well as whether or not to have children, and the timing, of having children. All of these decisions are being impacted by an increased likelihood that your marriage is going to end in divorce, as compared to 100 years ago. And I think there's this great quote from your textbook, and it's quoting this author, Thomas. And she says, "It's a hard truism that every generation is shaped by its war. But Generation X's war, she believes, was the ultimate war at home, divorce." And so it just, the impact that divorce had on this particular generation, Generation X, these were the children during the divorce revolution, the children who were the first to kind of experience, divorce in kind of large numbers. And your textbook does note that although she was determined to never put her children through the same thing, eventually she did wind up getting divorced herself. Now, a trend to watch in regards to who's getting divorced relates to the term gray divorce. And these are people who are getting divorced now later in life, the baby boom generation, people who were born between 1946 and 1964, making them between the ages of 57 and 75 now. You would think that they would be past the point of getting a divorce, that if they're still married at this point in their lives, that they're going to remain married. But actually, they are experiencing a boom in divorce, after the age 50. And this is called the gray divorce revolution. And sometimes the divorces that they're getting aren't even the divorces from their first marriage, which perhaps ended during the divorce revolution, but it's in fact divorces for their second or third marriage. And so Cohen just notes that divorce at an older age may be unique to this generation, or it could just be an increasing feature in families. So just because we're currently seeing it right now in the baby boom generation, who are our older citizens, we aren't sure, is this going to remain unique to them, or is, these late in life divorces just going to be an increasing feature in families moving forward? And so the first article from this chapter that I'm suggesting that you read is about gray divorce. It's called Gray Divorce, Its Reasons and Its Implications. And I encourage you to read this and consider some of those points they're making about the potential social consequences of this trend. So now we come to the fourth section of this chapter, which is entitled Causes of Divorce. And so, one thing to just kind of note, or several things to note before we get into this part of the chapter, divorce, although it is intimate and personal, it is a product of larger social forces. And so we're going to be talking about the causes and contributors of divorce, both at an individual level, but also at a larger societal level. And Cohen does note that, most sociologists are, always skeptical when someone talks about the cause of a social event or pattern. And that's because, when you're talking about human behavior, there are a lot of contributing factors that lead to that behavior, that lead to that decision. And we, when we're collecting data, even though we might use the language of causality, it's very different than like the experiments that happen, in labs, with animals, or with elements, or things that can be controlled in a lab setting so that a true cause can be pinpointed. We can't really do that with human behavior. So in a lot of ways, we're talking more about correlates more than causes. And so if you think about it that way, what are some correlates for divorce? What seems to, for whom is divorce more likely to be common? And Cohen says, based on the data that we have, people with less education, African Americans, American Indians, those who are early in their marriages, as well as those who have been married before. These are all some common correlates with getting a divorce. Some other ones that, when I have class, that I like to kind of point out. If we're looking at the larger societal reasons, we've already talked about the change in divorce laws, the rise of no-fault divorce laws, religious institutions, that growing shift away from the church, as well as the fact that the church has just kind of loosened up its stance on divorce, or a lot of religious denominations have. The economy, which Cohen does talk about, that's why I have it highlighted in green. So I will come back to that one later in this section. Military service. When you're married to someone in the military, although they are more likely to marry, they're also more likely to get a divorce, particularly during periods where, because of military engagements, skirmishes, if you have people being stationed away from their home, for long periods of time, or, repeated tours, this, does impact divorce. This does make it more likely for them to get a divorce. So we do see our divorce rate go slightly up during these types of periods in our society. Cultural values. The kind of increased value that we place on individual happiness and individual fulfillment, as well as just the kind of decreased stigma around divorce, means that, just on the societal level, divorce is more accepted, making it a more likely option. Social integration. So, the fact that uh, individuals have kind of more social integration, while families are almost, operating more as separate entities. It means both that there is maybe less pressure to remain in your marriage so that you have a place in society, because that you can have a place in society even without being married. And then finally, technology. Certainly technology has increased both, it has had an impact both on infidelity, people's likeliness to engage in it, and people's, the likelihood that people are going to get caught engaging in it. And infidelity is one of the individual reasons that people get a divorce. So now what we consider to be demographic reasons are really just correlates that we have shown through quantitative analyses, that exist between, that seem to factor into the likelihood that someone's going to get a divorce. So there's parental divorce, and this is always open to debate. Why is the why is the fact that your parents got a divorce likely to impact your likelihood of getting a divorce? And there are different arguments for this, but a term that sometimes comes up is intergenerational transmission. In some way, the likelihood of getting a divorce is transmitted from one generation to the other. Age at marriage, which is one that Cohen discusses, so we'll come back to that one. Premarital pregnancy and childbearing. Having children before you get married seems to go along with an increased risk of divorce. Premarital cohabitation, another one that Cohen mentioned, so we will talk about that one further. The presence of children, this one is complicated because both the number and the sex of children can both make divorce more or less likely, depending. gender, race and ethnicity, which uh, for race and ethnicity, um, the fact that African Americans and American Indians are most likely to get a divorce might also somewhat be related to income and social class, which uh, is something that Cohen focuses on. So we'll talk more about that one. Religiosity, people who are more religious are just less likely to get a divorce, even as the power has kind of shifted away from the church to the state. For people who are personally religious, this does still just impact their interest and acceptance of divorce as a choice for them. Education, people with lower levels of education are more likely to get a divorce. We've talked about this when we talked about marriage, but similarity between spouses. So basically, if you have a marriage that we would consider to be endogamous, meaning a marriage between like people, that marriage is less likely to result in a divorce than marriages that are exogenous, marriages between people who are different in regards to race or religion or even income. And then, even though that says individual reasons, it should say individual reasons. So, this is at the kind of micro individual level. What are some factors that influence people's likelihood of getting a divorce? Unrealistic expectations. So, just kind of going into marriage with an unrealistic idea of what it is. Obviously, conflict and abuse. When relationships are defined by conflict and abuse, they're unhappy as well as just, dangerous and toxic, and they are more likely to end in divorce. Infidelity is still kind of a main reason that people give, although it's not the primary reason people give for ending a marriage. It is still one of the kind of main reasons that comes up as to why people are seeking a divorce. Relationship dynamics, and this is discussed by Cohen, particularly through the lens of communication and marital satisfaction. And so for these ones that Cohen is emphasizing, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these because you do have that material, from your textbook. But one thing that he makes is the role of cohabitation, and we've talked about that. When we talked about cohabitation in a previous chapter, that there is the cohabitation effect. First of all, the idea that people who cohabit aren't any more likely to get married than people who don't cohabit. They're actually less likely. But then also the fact that people who have cohabited, that does seem to be a correlate to likelihood of getting a divorce. And Cohen kind of talks through, how do we interpret that effect. Age is a lot more straightforward. People who are older when they first marry are less likely to get a divorce. It may be because they're making more sensible decisions. It might be because they're more emotionally mature or better educated or financially secure. But definitely people who marry before the age of 20 are just more likely to get a divorce within the first 10 years, as opposed to people who wait and get married after the age of 25. In regards to relationship dynamics, divorce usually follows unhappiness and conflict within a marriage. So couples are more likely to get a divorce if they describe themselves as being unhappy, if they don't spend a lot of alone time with each other, if they disagree frequently, if they about things like household tasks or sex or in-laws. And if they have heated arguments, shout at or hit each other. And so you can kind of compare that to like this Pew Research poll that, was asking about what makes marriage work. And the things that they say that makes marriage work, things like, sharing household chores, having a happy sexual relationship, having shared taste and interests, agreement on politics. You can kind of see how the opposite of those things are some of those things that Cohen notes that contributes to the poor relationship dynamics that can lead to divorce. Now, kind of, turning to employment and income. So there was, as divorce was becoming a concern to people by even the end of the 19th century, some early social critics were kind of pointing the finger at women, women's suffrage, the increased ability for women to work outside of the home. And they were saying that that was the contributing kind of, that was the social force behind these higher rates of divorce. And certainly after the divorce revolution, that escalated in the 1970s through the 80s, um, once again, it was seen as it's because women have this ability to be in the workforce and to have lives outside of the home and the domestic sphere. And so women's independence was thought by some to be a contributing factor to divorce. However, as Cohen notes, the research show is actually a little bit more complicated because it shows that women's independence has two types of effects that can both strengthen or weaken marriage. So when women have the economic means to survive on their own, they are more likely to end their marriage, but only if the marriage itself is unhappy. And so this is what's called the independence effect of women's employment, meaning you can't trap a woman in an unhappy marriage if she has the ability to be financially independent. However, women's independence can also strengthen marriage because couples that have higher education are less likely to divorce. Couples where they make more money are less likely to divorce. And so this idea that women, particularly those who are higher educated and who have more higher paying jobs, are less likely to divorce. This is called the income effect of employment. But kind of taking a step back and thinking about this on a macro social lens, what about just the economy broadly speaking? Well, looking at our data from the recession of the late 2000s, we know that in some ways the recession caused divorces, but in some ways it also prevented divorces. So in terms of the causes, well, a lot of that has to do with, at just kind of the individual level, it contributed to stress at home, job loss, home loss, all of those types of things maybe, led some people to decide, hey, we want to divorce. But the high cost of divorce also kept a lot of couples together. People could not afford to consider legal fees, as well as just the logistical concerns that come about when you want to turn one home into two. And so we actually saw the number of divorces kind of go down during the recession. But even what's been interesting is, post recession, even when we've had years of kind of economic prosperity, we have not necessarily seen our divorce rates go back up to the rates that they were pre recession. So now I come to the fifth section, consequences of divorce. And, your book notes that divorce is not the expected outcome of marriage. Most people don't go into marriage saying, oh, I know that this marriage is going to end in divorce. Yet people do consider a divorce and get a divorce because sometimes it is the better option as opposed to staying in an unhappy marriage. And so for this reason, there may be some potential positive aspects to divorce that we don't often consider or think about. And this is where it can become very personal, because if you look at that activity, when is enough enough? Where to draw the line for divorce is not automatic. It's a product of a person's attitudes, their upbringing, and the wider cultural context. And it's worth noting that the cultural context about when enough is enough has shifted and changed. And so your textbook quotes historian Stephanie Kuntz, who has written quite extensively about kind of the shifting meanings of marriage and family, including divorce in the United States over time. You see that she says there, but for better or worse, people decide what they will and will not put up with in a relationship today on a totally different basis than they used to. And so, I encourage you to just kind of look over that activity and consider for yourself, what do you think are some good reasons to divorce or not to divorce? And just know that, how people respond to these questions, they vary, and there is not necessarily a national consensus around when is enough. And to illustrate that, you can look at figure 10.4, which is asking people, would they end a marriage over, infidelity, one-time infidelity? And you can see that, well, 10% said definitely and 23% said probably. Other people said definitely not and probably not. So, once again, that lack of national consensus. And that brings me to the second article that I'm suggesting that you read. And it's about, how one woman cheated, another was cheated on, and they tried to save their marriages, and how did that play out for them? And so, I ask you to read that article and just kind of consider, for thinking about this like sociologically, is there, societal pressure, more or less societal pressure now to leave or to stay, when you have, been the victim of infidelity or engaged in infidelity yourself? Does one choice have more or less stigma associated with it? Now, I didn't add a lot of additional material to this chapter, but one, set of concepts that I did add, um, is this process of divorce, understanding it through stations. And I want you to think about this, almost like a train metaphor where there are different stations, but it's not a perfect metaphor because unlike a train, which doesn't like necessarily loop back or go in reverse or, or go out of order, it's worth noting that if you're thinking about the six stations of divorce, they don't always go in order. Just because you get past a station doesn't mean that you won't necessarily find yourself back in that station before it's all over. Um, but for the person that kind of created this station metaphor, this is how they thought about it. The first station is emotional divorce, right? You have to divorce yourself emotionally from your partner, whether that is falling out of love, whether that is no longer thinking about them as your best friend, but you almost have to mentally and emotionally, or kind of disentangle yourself from the feelings and emotions of being in that marriage and partnership. The second station is the legal divorce. So, you've decided to get a divorce, you're working through this like emotional kind of disattachment from your partner. Now you have to bring in the state. And so different states have different policies and rules about pursuing a divorce legally. And then depending on your marriage itself, there's some issues that can come up when you're talking about getting a divorce. Some of those issues could be like alimony and spousal maintenance, right? So, what will you be paying? Who will be paying and what will you be paying to your former spouse? Child support, which we're going to talk about more um, in a few, on an upcoming slide, is another issue that can be something that has to be considered when at this legal divorce station. Economic divorce. So this is the money part of it. For a lot of married couples, because you blend your finances as well as combine your debts, this part of the divorce where you have to separate yourself financially, it can take a long time. It can actually be it can be the longest lasting component of the divorce, particularly if you have a lot of joint investments and ventures, or on the flip side, if you have a lot of joint debt, because, how do you clearly distinguish, between, what is his versus, what is hers, or, what is theirs? And this is once again something that can come up, in station two when you're doing the legal divorce. How are you going to handle, the money that you made together and the money that you owe together? And although some of this can be, handled by turning to your prenuptial agreement if you have one, it's worth noting that even people that have a very thorough prenuptial agreement, there are still some things that can come up during the course of a marriage that are not covered by that prenuptial agreement, which in some ways render it less than effective. Then the fourth station, co-parental divorce. This one is solely for people that, of course, have children together. And so this station, it kind of deals with kind of the relationship between former spouses who now are going to have to co-parent with one another, for the rest of their life, their child's life. And this goes beyond just kind of the legal requirements set up, through child support or visitation or guardianship. This really kind of speaks to the interaction, the social interaction, and approach that parents have. And there's this typology that kind of goes through, the different types of approaches that former spouses can take here. There's the perfect pals, where remain very friendly, you're on the same page, you're very close still even after the divorce, in making your parenting decisions and parenting together. Then there are cooperative colleagues, and the key word there is cooperative. It is still largely, you know, uh, supportive with one another and trying to be on the same page and work with one another, but it is not necessarily distinguished by being, overly friendly or intimate or close anymore. So you're a little bit more emotionally separate from one another as compared to the perfect pals. Then they're angry associates. You're trying to work together, but you're frequently angry with one another. You're at odds. And this makes it hard for you to be supportive of the other parents, rights and decisions and approaches to child rearing. Then they're fiery foes. They're even angrier than angry associates. This is where it perhaps gets extremely ugly. You're talking about one another to the child. You are perhaps even sabotaging the other parent's relationship with the child, the other parent's time with the child. This is a very ugly and non-conducive way to co-parent. And then there are dissolved duos. You literally just have you have nothing to do with one another, and maybe one parent isn't even really actively still involved in the child's life, or if you are both involved, you aren't really interacting with one another, and you have nothing to do with one another. Community divorce. So at this station, you have to consider things like, who's going to remain in the house, if anyone, who's going to, if you go to church, are you both going to still, who's going to get to keep the church and the church family. You're looking at your activities, you're looking at your community that you built as a couple, and you're going to have to figure out, like, to what extent are both of you going to remain within that community? Are you both going to try to remain within your community, or are you going to, split the community up, or is one person going to leave? And that's just because your community is used to interacting with you as a couple. So the fact that you are now going to be divorced and individuals, this means that some decisions do need to be made about, how are we still going to, operate, how are we still going to live with this community? Is it possible? And then finally, psychic divorce. That is truly moving past mentally this idea that you are a unit with this person, moving past this idea of having been married and having this marital connection with someone. And for the person that kind of created this station metaphor, they say that not all couples make it through this stage. The idea of no longer thinking about yourself through this lens of being married or having been married to this person, of being connected to this person, um, people don't always make it through that. For some people, even when they make it through all the other stations of the divorce, to a certain extent they always feel mentally connected, and to a certain extent their identity always is somewhat connected to this other person, even though they're no longer married to them. People who do make it through the stations, or most of the stations, can wind up being just as happy. But the textbook does note that divorced people are generally less happy than married people, although a lot of possibilities of how do we interpret that. It might just be, once again, a selection effect. Unhappy people are more likely to get divorced in the first place. So it's not the divorce making them unhappy. Maybe they're just unhappy. Divorce is still widely considered a failure, and can result in stigma. And so that's why they're unhappy. Um, Unhappiness, divorce does result, particularly in women, in a change in socioeconomic status, and that might be the source of unhappiness. And but one if you look at these graphs, you can kind of see that, satisfaction, um, you know, if it almost rises, it still doesn't quite meet people who are still married, but the satisfaction of people who are getting a divorce 5 years after their divorce is almost, roughly at the same level as people who, decide to remain married. And then if you're looking at, like, and the same thing with, like, mental stress, the stress levels are almost, within 2 years, back to the same levels as people who just decided to stay married. Um, Certainly, one contributing factor to why that gap in stress and satisfaction never quite meets, or never quite, reaches parity with people who stay married, has to be, as I noted, the economic status, particularly for women. So because women tend to make lower incomes, as well as the fact that because women are more likely to, um, retain, primary, guardianship, custody of their children, this means that, women after divorce are oftentimes, not just less financially stable as they were back when they were married, but they are less financially stable uh, than men who get a divorce. And so, your book notes women are twice as likely as men to be in poverty a year after divorce. And all of this, of course, kind of contributes to, I think I have this right, contributes to the feminization of poverty that we've talked about in a previous chapter. The fact that families that were headed by single mothers are more likely to be, impoverished. Now, what about not the adult well being, but children's well being? Well, we do know that divorce may negatively affect children's school performance and happiness, and it can also affect their relationship with their parents and just their general mental health. Physical health, as your textbook noted, is not usually harmed long term by family instability. Um, but the extent to which, um, y- that the extent to which their parents divorce, impacts children, is based upon a lot of different factors. And so your book goes over sociologist Paul Amato's, kind of model about the factors that affect children's experience of divorce. So he said, one thing we have to consider is the stressful aspects of the divorce process. There's less parental time and energy being spent on the child as they're working through the divorce. They lose contact with one child for periods of time. They might witness or become part of conflicts. And then there is the, possible subsequent, like, residential moves, job and school transitions, as well as economic hardship. At the same time, parents can engage in what Amato deems protective factors, as a way to try to offset some of these negative effects. They can make sure that children have coping skills, interpersonal skills, and self confidence. They can make sure that economic, educational, and other resources are provided, to help buffer their child. They can engage in attentive parenting, try to commit to diminish conflict, and ensure continued involvement of both parents after the divorce. And so, the extent to which the post divorce outcomes for the child are positive or negative have a lot to do with, To what extent are the stressful aspects present, and to what extent are the protective factors being utilized? But some of the post-divorce outcomes that Amato notes are, there can be short-term emotional or behavioral reactions or school problems. There can be kind of permanent emotional changes. And then just, there is going to be this kind of new roles and identities in their family and in their social environments as a result of the divorce. But once again, how negative all these things have to be, it kind of can vary family to family depending on the stressful factors present versus the protective factors present. So, before we kind of wrap up our discussion of children, let's talk a little bit more detail about child custody. So, there are no comprehensive national statistics on legal child custody arrangements after divorce. And even the legal arrangements might not be an accurate reflection of how the family lives their life day to day. But like based on like the information that we do have, we know that the great majority of children of divorced parents live primarily with their mothers, and this matters, as Cohen notes, for several reasons. First of all, it contributes to gender inequality, both by contributing to this idea, of course, that women are, natural child givers and are the, are necessarily the primary parent, and as opposed to seeing men as having this potential for caretaking and caregiving. And it also contributes to gender inequality because it adds this additional level of work to women who now might be single mothers. And of course, this can contribute to just not just to the women's own stress levels, but also just to the lack of resources, time, energy, and money that exist in that family structure that we've discussed when talking about the feminization of poverty. This also matters, that most children of divorced parents live with their mothers, because this definitely factors into the disputes over custody. And it's these disputes that really can contribute to negative consequences, short term and long term, for children of divorce. So, what is custody? That is the court mandated ruling as to which divorced parent will have primary responsibility for the welfare and upbringing of children. Sole custody, sometimes called primary custody, this is the parent that has the main responsibility for the child. The child lives with them, and they make the decisions, legal decisions, regarding the child. Joint custody, also called shared custody, has the child, living with both parents for some, amount of time, as well as both parents kind of making, legal decisions, medical decisions about the child. Split custody is very rare, but it happens when families have multiple children, in which case what can happen is one child has one parent as their primary parent, and another child is living with the other parent as the primary parent. Split custody is largely not recommended because it adds the additional disruption of breaking up sibling bonds and relationships, in addition to the marital bonds that we traditionally see being broken up in divorce. And you can note that when I'm talking about custody, I'm using both, custody to mean both physical custody and legal custody. There are sometimes custody decisions where, even though one parent might have sole physical custody, both parents have shared legal custody. So just know that there can be this additional language that is added, you know, to these custody decisions. Going along with custody, is the discussion of child support. Once again, uh, for the parent who has sole or primary custody, there might be the expectation that the non custodial parent provides some level of financial support, to help take care of the child, even though the child is not in their custody. Once again, this can be a source of dispute. Um, we know, not just from Amato's model, but from other empirical research, that maintaining good relationship and contact is good for parents and the child. This is something that is oftentimes weighed in decisions regarding custody and support, but in families that really want to make sure that their child has the best outcomes post divorce, even beyond what the courts decide, this should be a primary goal. And so, one issue that often comes up has to do with the level of father involvement with the child after the divorce. And this is because, as I noted, many times mothers. Retain primary custody of their children. And so this means that the fathers who don't live with their children, it can become very difficult to maintain close, supportive parenting relationships, leading to the typology of the three bad types of dads post divorce: deadbeats, Disneyland, disappearing dads. So deadbeats, well, that one's pretty clear. This is someone that largely just drops all of their parental obligations once their divorce is finalized. They no longer are there for their child physically or emotionally, even if they perhaps do things like pay the court required child support. Disneyland dads are there for their child, but in this fun kind of, rewards, let me be the fun parent, as opposed to that authoritative parenting that we discussed in the previous chapter, where you balance, support and fun with discipline. They leave all the disciplining to the primary parent, and instead kind of treat their time with their child as if it's just all vacation. Which also, it may not sound bad, but this also is them being derelict in their duties as a father. And then finally, they're disappearing dads. And these dads start off good. They start off very committed to remaining in their child's life, of being a positive force, of still being very active and hands on. But then over time, as they develop an alternative life, especially as they perhaps, remarry and start another family, or are now kind of the primary parent in another family, this can lead to them becoming less involved in their children's life, resulting in them now taking on behaviors more characteristic with the deadbeats and the Disneyland dads. All right, so this article is just kind of addressing, to what extent does gender bias exist in custodial decisions? Like, why do so many women receive, primary custody? Is it because men don't want primary custody, or is it because they are being denied primary or being denied joint custody? So this is just an interesting article that kind of, is measuring the extent to which gender bias might be fueling some of these decisions. So now I come to my final section, which is remarriage and blended families, which we kind of started talking about when we discussed the disappearing dads. But you get through all the stations of the divorce, and what happens next? Well, in America, traditionally, people don't divorce and then just stay single for the rest of their life. So people get a divorce and they start dating. They might even start cohabiting. And we do know that cohabiting is more common before remarriages than first marriages. And this might be because people are a little bit gun shy about, getting remarried. They want to avoid, getting into a relationship that might result in a second divorce. And because they aren't sociology students, they don't know about the cohabitation effect. So they think the best way to avoid a potential second divorce is to cohabit. And then at some point, people might remarry. And your book does note that most people who divorce, they do eventually remarry. And so this brings in a whole kind of, new set of language to talk about these families. So when we talk about blended families, there are a lot of different terms you can use. You can use blended family. You can use binuclear family, which is the preferred term from your textbook. You can use reconstituted family. I've seen that before. Step family is maybe, has traditionally been popular in our society, but all these families basically mean the same thing. thing. It's any family that includes step parents, step siblings, or half siblings. And when we are studying these types of families, they these types of families can become more complicated, complicated in terms of how people experience them, and complicated in terms of how researchers, study and make sense of them. And one of the things that contribute to this kind of complication is boundary ambiguity, which is, situations in which family members do not know or do not agree on who is in the family and what role each person can play. And that's because, although, these types of families have existed, for a long time, they haven't existed in large numbers, except maybe within like the last 40 or 50 years. And certainly, the roles and responsibilities that we associate with step parents and stepchildren, um, uh, they are not as culturally well established as the roles and responsibilities that we associate with, parents, and the kind of more standard parent child relationship. So your book gives you some just straightforward definitions about step parent, stepchild, step sibling, half sibling. And then they note that these definitions are becoming even more complicated in several ways. First of all, some step parents do eventually adopt their stepchildren legally. Second, some states have recently created legal definitions of step parent child relationships with specific rights and obligations attached to them, but this can vary. The extent to which these laws exist can vary by state, and what's in these laws can vary by state. And then finally, without a formal marriage, it may not be clear whether such a partner is actually a step parent. So, some people will like cohabit and live with a partner and almost be in what is almost like a common law marriage, which might work for them as marital partners. But then this really can complicate, what rights and responsibilities does that person have in regards to children that are not biologically their own, that are part of that family. And so, like I said, although this is not, brand new historically, it certainly has become more common as divorce has become more common. So, as your textbook notes, a lot of people remarry, and the amount of time between divorce and remarriage on average, is not like a huge amount of time. It's not like people are remarrying 20 years later on average. The median time is 3.8 years. And once again, it's our baby boomers who have led the growth of remarriage and divorce, because they were the kind of originators of the divorce revolution. And so they also have higher remarriage rates. Um, it's worth noting that, one implication that we see of divorced people being on the marriage market is they oftentimes end up marrying each other, which further kind of complicates, what do these binuclear families look like? Because in that case, maybe both partners are coming in with children of their own, former spouses of their own. Remarriage is actually less common after widowhood, than after divorce now. And so, of course, 150 years ago, this would have been opposite. People who were widowed, both men and women, were expected to marry. And part of this is probably because people are living longer. So people who experience widowhood are experiencing it at later ages and might just not be interested, in remarrying, as well as maybe just don't have the opportunity to remarry, because there's also a gender gap, among older people, where older women vastly outnumber older men. So, there are characteristics of remarriage that your book talks about, the presence of children, race and ethnicity, gender. Men are more likely to remarry than women. There's some racial ethnic groups that are more likely to remarry than others. Age, once again, kind of what that gender gap among older people, as well as just kind of the fact that right now remarriage is highly concentrated among the baby boomers. Those are some important trends to note. Some additional material that I want you to kind of know about binuclear families and what makes them complicated, in terms of both the people who live in them and the people who study them, can be best expressed by using the language of systems or subsystems. So if the family is the system, there are multiple subsystems that exist within binuclear families. Sorry, I had a bit of a coughing break there. So one subsystem that exists within binuclear families are the former spouses, right? So the people that used to be married to one another, and their relationship with one another and their ongoing communication and interaction with one another can vary, family to family. But certainly their relationship with one another can have an impact on the other subsystems within the binuclear family system. Then there is the remarried couple subsystem. So, they are married, but unlike people who are marrying for the first time, they have all of these kind of other subsystems: former spouse, parent child, stepfather, stepfather, stepmother, mother, father, all these other systems that they have to consider from pretty much day one of their marriage, which people who are marrying for the first time oftentimes don't have to consider. And so this comes with an additional kind of set of stressors and burden. I don't want to use burdens, let's just use stressors. So it comes with an additional kind of set of potential stressors that they have to consider from almost day one of their marriage. And then there's the parent child subsystem. So there is, the parent child subsystem, not just the biological parent, adopted parent, but this new parent, stepmothers and stepfathers. And so, families have to kind of decide and determine for themselves, what are the roles and expectations, for the stepmother and the stepfather, and particularly stepmothers. If you're looking at it culturally, they've gotten a very bad rap, and I just give a couple examples there from Disney movies, right? But um, what does it mean to now be expected to be a parent, to a child, who is not your own, and does still have a mother and father in a lot of cases, one that they maybe live with primarily, if the person you're married to does not have primary custody, or maybe a parent that they don't necessarily see regularly, if the person that you married is their primary parent. So all of this, of course, just once again comes with its own kind of unique tensions that have to be addressed. Then, of course, there are these subsystems that exist within the children, the siblings, the sibling, step sibling, half sibling subsystem. They develop bonds with one another, and but how close are those bonds? It can vary once again by family, and this becomes an issue, right, about mediating disputes and settling things about, time, energy, and financial resources. How are they split between, siblings and step siblings and half siblings? And then the final subsystem is, what I kind of indicated when talking about the parent child, is at the same time the kind of person is serving as a stepmother, stepfather, there is a mother father in another household, right? And so they interact with one another as well. So all of this, of course, is just some unique structural differences that we see in binuclear families. And this is something, like I said, that has to be considered by, those who both, exist within those families and those who are studying those families. And this is not just some, like, small, minute part of the population. As your textbook notes, more than one child out of six under the age of 18 now live in blended families. So children today experience blended families, at a much higher rate than in the past. And so I give you one article, that I would like for you to read about blended families, and what does this mean in terms of, rights and responsibilities. It comes from a blog that was featured on New York Times, and it's called "In Blended Families, Responsibility Blurs." And I kind of note here that I thought this article was interesting because it raises how these issues don't necessarily resolve even as the children become adults with step parents. We oftentimes focus on, the experience of children in blended families, but what about, even as they get older, and they are adults, what does this mean in terms of some important decisions that can happen later in life? So I encourage you to read this article and consider those points. And that is it for this chapter.